The neural output is exceeding parameters.
Wait, that structure is unknown. It's activating.
The Keth-Varel war machine had never paused for anything. In 41 years of continuous expansion, the Keth-Varel had not stopped for weather, for logistics, for casualties, for diplomacy, or for the 11 species that had attempted to negotiate a ceasefire before their civilizations were incorporated into the Keth-Varel's advancing structure. The war machine moved. It had always moved. The concept of pausing was so foreign to Keth-Varel military doctrine that their language did not have a word for it that was not also the word for defeat. On the morning of the 14th day of the Outer Zone campaign, the war machine paused. Not because of an attack, not because of a tactical failure, not because humanity had done something unexpected on the battlefield. Because of what was inside one human soldier's head. The Keth-Varel's pre-battle neural scanning protocol had been standard procedure for 30 years. Before any ground engagement, they scanned the opposing force's command-level personnel, not for intelligence, though the intelligence value was significant, but for threat modeling. The scans told them how the opposing commanders thought, what they prioritized, how they made decisions under pressure, where their courage came from and therefore where it could be broken. 30 years of scans had produced a database of enemy psychology that was, in the Keth-Varel's strategic assessment, their most decisive advantage. You could not fight effectively against something you did not understand. They understood everyone they had ever fought. Sergeant First Class James Aucaffer had been selected for scanning because the Keth-Varel's tactical intelligence unit had identified him as a command-level asset, not an officer, but the kind of enlisted soldier whose unit deferred to his judgment even when a commissioned officer was present, which the Keth-Varel's analysts correctly understood was more strategically significant than official rank. They took him at 300 hours, 3 days before the scheduled engagement, from a forward observation post that their infiltration team had located through standard reconnaissance. The extraction was clean. Aucaffer did not resist because Aucaffer had read his unit's briefing on Keth-Varel capture protocols and knew that resistance before a scan was the one thing that guaranteed a worse outcome than compliance. He went with them. He was calm. This was the first thing the scan team noted in their preliminary report. Subject displays no measurable fear response to capture or transport, categorized as high psychological resilience. Scheduled for deep protocol. The deep protocol scan took 4 hours. The Keth-Varel's lead neural analyst was a specialist named Vethkal who had been conducting military brain scans for 19 years and who had in 19 years scanned the minds of 216 enemy command-level personnel from 14 species. She had never stopped a scan early. She had never requested an emergency consultation with the strategic command during a scan. She had never, in 19 years, sat with the results of a scan in her hands for 40 minutes without filing the report, because filing the report was the first thing you did when a scan was complete, and it had never before been a thing she needed to think about. She sat with James Aucaffer's scan results for 40 minutes. Then she filed a report that was not the standard threat modeling document. It was a request, classified at the highest level, addressed directly to the campaign's supreme commander, marked urgent in a way that the Keth-Varel's communication system only permitted for information that could affect the outcome of an active campaign. The request said, "I need you to read this scan before we proceed. I need you to read all of it. I cannot file the threat model without you understanding what is in it, because the threat model I would file based on this scan would be the most dangerous document I have ever produced, and I need you to decide whether to act on it." Supreme Commander Drev Voss had been commanding Keth-Varel campaigns for 26 years. He had received urgent classified requests from his intelligence division before tactical adjustments, enemy movement updates, logistics alerts. He had never received a request from a neural analyst asking him to read a scan result before she filed the threat model. He read it. He read it in his command center with the door closed and his senior staff outside and no recording devices active, because those were Vethkal's conditions for transmitting it, conditions she had never imposed on any previous report and that Drev Voss had accepted without negotiation, because the fact that she was imposing them told him more than he wanted to know about what was coming. He read it for 2 hours. Then he ordered the campaign paused. Not delayed, not rescheduled, paused, an instruction that required him to use a word that Ethveral military doctrine did not officially recognize, that his senior staff received with an expression that Drev Voss had never seen on military personnel before, and that went into effect at 900 hours, 3 days before 14,000 Kethveral ground forces were scheduled to begin the engagement that their strategic models said would complete the Outer Zone campaign in 72 hours. James Aucaffer was returned to his unit at 1100 hours, unharmed, with a formal communication from Supreme Commander Drev Voss addressed to the Human Boundary Authority's commanding officer requesting a meeting, not a negotiation, not a ceasefire discussion. A meeting, specifically between the Supreme Commander and whatever human representative could answer the questions that the scan had produced. The Human Boundary Authority's commanding officer, Major General Sira Adichie Park, received the request and spent 45 minutes reading it before she responded. The request described, in the careful language of a military communication that was trying to say something it did not have established vocabulary for, what the Kethveral's neural scan had found in James Aucaffer's mind, what they had expected to find. And why the difference between the two had caused a war machine that had not paused in 41 years to stop. What they had expected to find was what they always found in command-level military personnel, the psychology of a fighter, the neurological signature of someone who had been trained and conditioned and selected for the capacity to apply force effectively. The threat modeling framework was built on this expectation, because in 30 years of scanning enemy command personnel, that was what enemy command personnel contained. The courage came from training and unit cohesion and the suppression of the survival instinct under combat conditions. The decision-making came from doctrine and experience. The commitment came from loyalty to the unit, fear of failure, belief in the mission. 30 years of variations on the same structure across 14 species, 216 individuals. The structure was reliable. The threat models built from it were accurate. The campaigns that followed from those threat models had won. James Aucaffer's scan did not contain this structure. It contained something that Vethkal had spent 40 minutes staring at before she could name, and another 40 minutes naming before she could decide what to do with the name. The decision-making architecture was present, experience, doctrine, the accumulated pattern recognition of 11 years of service. The unit cohesion markers were present. The suppression of the survival instinct under combat conditions was present, measurable within the range the database predicted for high-resilience personnel. Everything the threat model expected was there. And underneath it, older and deeper and more fundamental than any of it, was something that the database had no category for. Because the database had been built from 30 years of scans of people who fought for comprehensible reasons, survival, loyalty, mission, fear of consequences, and what was underneath James Aucaffer's trained responses was not any of those things. It was grief. Not personal grief, not the grief of individual loss, though that was present too, woven into the structure at the level of specific memories that the scan had mapped with the clinical precision that deep protocol required. Beneath the personal grief was something larger and older, a grief that was not about specific people, but about a specific understanding of what happened when things were lost, when places were lost. When the ordinary texture of the lives that people had built in a specific place over generations was taken from them by something that did not ask and did not stop. The scan had mapped this grief with the same precision it mapped everything else. And what Vethkal had understood, sitting with the results for 40 minutes, was that this grief was not a weakness in the threat model. It was not a vulnerability to exploit. It was not the thing that would break James Ockhaffer's courage when the engagement reached its worst moment. It was the thing that made his courage impossible to break. Because the Keth-Verrill's threat models worked by identifying the basis of an enemy's willingness to fight, and then applying pressure to that basis, training broke under sufficient attrition. Unit cohesion broke when the unit was reduced past the threshold that made cohesion feel meaningful. Mission belief broke when the mission's achievability became sufficiently uncertain. Fear of consequences broke when the consequences of continuing became worse than the consequences of stopping. Every basis of willingness to fight had a breaking point, and 30 years of scans had mapped those breaking points with enough precision that the Keth-Verrill's campaigns knew, before they began, exact how much pressure was required and where to apply it. You could not apply pressure to grief. Not the kind the scan had found. Not grief that was not about winning or losing, but about the specific unacceptability of what happened when something was taken from people who had not agreed to give it. You could make the grief worse. You could make it unbearable. But making grief unbearable did not break the willingness to fight that the grief was powering. It intensified it. And the intensification had no ceiling, because the grief itself had no ceiling, because it was not a calculation and therefore could not be recalculated past a breaking point. The Keth-Verrill's threat model for human forces, built from James Ockhaffer's scan and cross-referenced against the behavioral data from the 14 months of the Outer Zone campaign, produced a projection that Vethkal had needed Drev Voss to read personally before she filed it, because the projection said something that no threat model in 30 years had said. It said, "We cannot win this engagement. Not cannot win quickly. Not cannot win without unacceptable losses. Cannot win. The engagement could be completed. The Keth-Verrill had numerical and technological advantages sufficient to take the ground they were targeting. But the campaign model that followed from the engagement's completion, when applied to the psychology the scan had revealed, produced a projection that extended past every timeline the Keth-Verrill's strategic planning had ever worked with. Because the engagement's completion would not end the resistance, it would deepen the grief. And deepened grief in a species whose willingness to fight was powered by it did not produce the diminishing returns that the campaign models predicted for every other species. It produced acceleration. Drev Voss had read this projection in his closed command center and had sat with it the way Vethkal had sat with the scan results, not disbelieving it. Because he had been reading Vethkal's work for 19 years and had never found cause to disbelieve it, but needing time to understand what believing it required him to do. What it required him to do was pause. Not because he could not win, because the winning in this case would produce something that the Keth-Verrill's 41 years of expansion had never produced before, an enemy that did not diminish after defeat. An enemy that the campaign model said would require continuous engagement indefinitely, at costs that escalated rather than declined. Against a resistance that the grief in James Ockhaffer's scan suggested would never reach the point where the people feeling it decided that stopping was better than continuing. The meeting between Drev Voss and Major General Adichie Park took place at a neutral location, a station in the outer zone that neither party controlled, chosen by Drev Voss specifically because choosing it demonstrated that he was not negotiating from a position he wanted the other party to feel pressured by. He arrived with 2 aides. She arrived with 1. He told her what the scan had found. All of it, not the threat model. The scan itself, what Vethkal had found underneath the trained responses, what the grief was, what it meant for the campaign model, and what the campaign model said about the outcome of continuing. He did this because Vethkal had told him, in the same conversation in which she had asked him to read the scan, that the most dangerous thing he could do with the information it contained was to use it as a tactical advantage without telling the other side what he had learned. She had said, "If you use this without telling them, you are making a decision about their future based on something they do not know you know, and that is the kind of decision that confirms everything the grief is about." He had understood what she meant. He told Adichie Park everything. She listened without interrupting for 40 minutes. Then she said, "You paused a campaign because of what you found in one soldier's head." Drevva said, "I paused a campaign because of what it told me about what you are." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that holds something important and knows it. Adichie Park said, "And what are we?" Drevva said, "You are a species that fights with something we cannot model as a resource because it does not diminish when we apply pressure to it. Every species we have campaigned against has had a threshold, a point where the cost exceeded the value and the rational calculation changed. Your scan does not contain that threshold. The grief that powers your resistance is not a calculation. It is a judgment about what is unacceptable, and judgments do not respond to pressure the way calculations do." Adichie Park was quiet for a moment, then she said, "So you stopped." Drevva said, "I stopped because the alternative was a campaign with no projected endpoint, and a campaign with no projected endpoint is not a campaign, it is a condition, and I have been running campaigns for 26 years and I know the difference." The negotiations that followed the meeting took 4 months. They were not easy and they were not clean, and they did not produce an agreement that anyone considered perfect. They produced an agreement that both parties considered survivable, which was what the situation required and which was, in Vethkal's private assessment when she reviewed the final terms, more than she had thought possible on the morning she sat with the scan results and tried to decide what to do with them. She sent one message after the agreement was signed. It went to James Ockhafer directly, through a channel that the agreement had established for exactly this kind of communication, because one of the agreement's provisions was that the Keth-Verrill's neural scan data was to be returned to the individuals it had been taken from intact and unredacted as a condition of the ceasefire. The message said, "I scanned your mind before a battle and found something I did not expect. What I found stopped the battle. I am returning the scan to you because it belongs to you, and because I want you to know that what I found in you is the reason you are reading this message instead of fighting in the engagement that was scheduled for the morning of day 14. You did not know you were carrying something that powerful. I thought you should know." James Ockhafer read the message at 700 hours on a Thursday morning, in a forward base that was no longer a forward base because the campaign the base had been built to support was no longer a campaign. He read it twice. Then he folded the data unit and put it in his pocket and went to find his unit, because they were breaking down the base and there was work to do and the work was not going to do itself. His unit lead, a woman named Corporal Yemi Tanaka, who had been with him for 6 years and who knew him well enough to read his face accurately, looked at him when he arrived and said, "You look like someone told you something big." Ockhafer said, "Someone returned something that belonged to me." Tanaka said, "What was it?" Ockhafer was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Evidence that the thing we carry when we fight matters more than the thing we carry in our hands." Tanaka thought about this while she finished breaking down the equipment she was packing. Then she said, "Was it worth scanning for?" Ockhafer said, "Apparently it stopped a war." Tanaka stopped packing. She looked at him. He handed her the message. She read it. She handed it back. She went back to packing. And after a moment she said quietly to the equipment and the base and the morning, we never knew that was what we were carrying." Ockhafer said, "No. Tanaka said, and they found it in 41 years of campaigns and 4 hours of scanning. Okafor said, yes. Tanaka was quiet again, then she said, I think I want to sit with that for a while. Okafor said, I think we all do. They finished breaking down the base. The work took until noon. The transport arrived at 1400 hours and took them back through the corridor that was no longer a contested corridor because the agreement had redrawn the boundary and the redrawing had made the contesting unnecessary. The transport was crowded and loud and smelled like military equipment that had been used in the field for too long. Which is to say it smelled exactly like every transport James Okafor had been in for 11 years of service. He sat by the window. He watched the corridor go by. He thought about what Veth Call had found and what it had done and what it meant that something he had been carrying inside him since before he enlisted, something that he had never named or examined or understood as a resource, had been the thing that ended the campaign. He had not known. None of them had known. They had carried it the way you carry something you grew up with, something so familiar that you stopped seeing it as a thing you were carrying and started experiencing it as simply the way you felt about certain matters, the grief, the specific unacceptability of certain kinds of loss, the judgment about what could not be allowed to happen to the places and the people that made life worth the living of it. They had carried it into every engagement without knowing it was their most powerful weapon. The enemy had scanned it, had quantified it, had built a model around it and had looked at the model and had stopped. James Okafor watched the corridor go by and thought, we did not know what we were. They found out before we did, and what they found made them choose not to fight us. He thought about that for the rest of the transit. He is still thinking about it. So are the Kethveral. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with a fellow HFY fan, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories coming.